This is Beyond the Verdict. I'm John Horford with Myrene Cook, and today we are continuing our conversation about the death of Brandon Mitchner. Myrene and I both walked away from that last episode with Shirley, Brandon's mother, and had told her that we would look into it and just have conversations with some of the contacts that we know. In this case, actually, specifically that Myrene knows. And she has a relationship with one of the prosecutors that was involved in this case. And then we took a look at the police report and looked at a few other things. Not that we're trying to be investigators by any means, but just to try to paint a clear picture and dig into why, in Shirley's words, this case wasn't investigated. And what we discovered was that this case was pretty thoroughly investigated by the state police, by LPD, by the Attorney General's office, by the prosecutors. A lot of time and resources were put into this case, and as frustrating as it is, there just wasn't enough evidence to continue or to charge anyone in this case. And they had made comments to the effect of, once there is more evidence, or if someone is willing to come forward, if someone does know anything, we would reconsider it, because we would love to get closure for Brandon's family and everybody that loved and cared about him. The most heartbreaking part of this case, in my opinion, is just seeing that video, knowing that whether the individual in the video with Brandon pushed him or whether Brandon fell, just based on the reaction, running back sort of in a panic, you know that they know what happened one way or another. And to have them then go to police, which is in the police report, have conversations with them and essentially say that they lost sight of Brandon and didn't know where he went, and then that's what caused the reaction. It feels disingenuous, but at the same time, the police also determined that the business partner had cooperated with them and they did not think that he was lying. Myrene, you had a conversation with a prosecutor that was involved in this case. Do you mind sharing?
Yeah, I did. I think that when we had our last episode with Shirley Mitchner, your heart breaks for her and her family. And you want to do everything you can to reassure her that, things were done. This was taken seriously. The investigation was very thorough. As a prosecutor, the most difficult thing is not being able to give a family closure when they've lost a loved one. And I can tell you from numerous cases that, unfortunately, you can't always do that. As much as you may want to, as much as you may think that there is something else going on, or even if you have a suspect and you believe that suspect was completely and utterly involved in whatever happened to the loved one, sometimes you just can't prove it. And I think that's, a heartbreaking thing on top of it all. That can be very difficult. When looking back at the Bowman case, for years after Andrea went missing, we all in law enforcement, prosecutors who were dealing with the case, pretty much all agreed that Bowman was somehow involved in her disappearance. But it took a very long time to be able to prove that. And we only were able to do that in that case because Bowman eventually confessed. He confessed and told us where the body was. And so sometimes it takes nothing short of that kind of confession to be able to solve a case when there weren't any other eyewitnesses. So after our last episode, I reached out to John DeWayne, who is the Ingham County prosecutor, and I explained, what we were doing, and we had Shirley on in this podcast, and we were just, trying to reassure her basically that the investigation was thorough and they did everything possible they could to solve the case. And I have to thank John for speaking with me. He didn't have to do that. I wasn't a party to the case. I wasn't part of it. But prosecutor to prosecutor, I just wanted to know, was everything done? And John had listened to our episode with Shirley and listened to everything that we talked about.
And that was before he had spoken to you. He had already listened to it, correct?
Yes, he listened to it as soon as I had reached out before we were able to connect.
Okay.
And so the very first thing that he said was, Myrene, I want you to understand this case was very thoroughly investigated by multiple agencies. And so I asked how that happened. And he indicated it was Lansing Police Department at first. And then they actually had the Sheriff's Department assisting. The Ingham County Sheriff's Department did some of their own investigation as well. The Michigan State Police looked into the case, as did the Attorney General's office. And they all came to the same conclusion that the Ingham County Prosecutor's Office did, which was, unfortunately, there just wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone with a crime. And that can be a very hard thing to take and to understand, that there's got to be something out there, right? I mean, we all want there to be a crime that's solvable, that you find justice. But unfortunately, sometimes it just doesn't work that way.
And this genuinely seems to be that type of case. And the other thing that a lot of people reached in and were talking to us about was, is there really no duty to act? If someone really is in trouble or falls into a situation where their life is in danger, do you really not have to do anything? And in the state of Michigan, there is generally no legal duty to act or provide assistance to someone that's in danger unless a special relationship exists. So bystanders are not required by law to help someone in an emergency. Special relationships would be like a parent has to, help their kid in those situations, or an employer to employee in some situations, or a caregiver towards the people that are under their care, or, a school, like teachers and administrators towards students. Situations like that are obviously, I don't even necessarily know that police fully have a duty to act. Myrene, do you know if that's the case? Isn't it true that police don't always have a duty to act?
So it's not necessarily the same as a citizen. When you're looking at a regular citizen, some states call it like a Good Samaritan law.
Yeah.
As a Good Samaritan, you have a right or a duty in some states to act and try to assist those who might be in danger who are there with you. Michigan doesn't have that law. And, one of the pitfalls of that kind of law is, what if you are being a Good Samaritan and you try to help somebody out, for example, in a car accident, and you think that car might, catch on fire, or you're trying to get the person out of the car, yet unfortunately, by taking them out of the car, you injure them even more than they were before. There have been some places in some states where those Good Samaritans were actually sued by the person they were trying to help. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons here in Michigan we don't have that law currently.
But don't we have some version of do we have some version of a Good Samaritan law in Michigan?
I don't know if it's exactly that or not. There are a few laws out there that it might qualify, like, for example, if let's say, for example, there are two people and they're both using drugs and one of them overdoses. The other person there with them using the drugs calls for an ambulance to help save that person's life. Neither one of them can be charged necessarily with the drugs that were a result of that overdose, because you want someone to act to try to get people help. So there are things like that in the law in Michigan, but nothing that would apply to the facts and circumstances of this specific case. One of the other things I was going to mention too, so, a lot of times as a prosecutor, law enforcement may hit a roadblock where they've done everything they can, they've investigated everything, they've interviewed everybody more than once, they have other agencies look at it, which is what they did here. But from what I was told, they also went above and beyond and had multiple different prosecutors in the prosecutor's office look at the investigation, everything that they'd compiled, every witness, the video, and everything else. And they had multiple prosecutors all come to the same conclusion: was there just wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone. And I think that's hard, particularly when you're looking at that video. You see Brandon and his business partner walking together, and you see them go out of shot for, what was it, 11 seconds?
11 seconds.
And then the only person that comes back into that camera view is the business partner with no Brandon.
And he looks distressed. Yes.
Exactly. So, do I think that there was something that he saw? Yeah, there was something that prompted him to run away from that area. And whether that was Brandon fell and went into the river himself or slipped down an embankment and couldn't get back up, I don't think we will ever know unless that business partner is able to articulate that, because it doesn't sound like there were any other witnesses right then and there that could tell us.
Isn't it strange, though, that police said that the business partner cooperated fully and they believed that he was being completely honest when he made the statement that he sort of lost track of Brandon and didn't know where he was, and then just assumed that Brandon went home?
Yeah, I think it's weird. I think it's weird he ran from the scene. I think it's weird, if this is his friend and his partner and his buddy and all of that, that if he did slip and fall, that, you should have helped him. But one of the other factors we have to look at is how intoxicated were they? Because unfortunately, sometimes when people are intoxicated, they don't make the best decisions. And so that may have come into play with the decision making, or quite honestly, lack of decision making by the business partner. That may have been a factor too.
Had he not reacted in the way that he did in the video, I would say that's absolutely within the realm of possibility. But just his body language, he was clearly startled or frightened or something. Like, it wasn't like, oh, where's Brandon? Or, oh, I guess he just went home. It was like, there was like some panic in there. Very, very strange. And again, oh, go ahead.
You went through the police report too, right?
Yeah, I looked at there was a version that was very redacted that I was able to find online.
Do you recall whether or not the business partner said he called for Brandon or called out for him, anything like that?
I don't remember. I don't believe that he did. I believe that it said that he thought Brandon went home, or he couldn't find Brandon and he just assumed that he went home. So then he decided that he was going to leave too. So, and I guess he went out and continued to go out. Like he went to another bar that night or went somewhere.
One of the difficulties too is looking at this. If you assume for a minute that the business partner, let's just say the business partner pushed him or did something like that, we have to be able to prove in the state of Michigan what happened. So, for example, to prove a first-degree premeditated murder, we have to be able to prove that there was a premeditation, there was deliberation. Everybody says, what does that mean? Premeditation is you had to plan it, you had to think about it. And the deliberation is you thought about it long enough to act, right? It can take seconds, it could take minutes, it can take longer, but it doesn't have to be any specified length of time. For murder in the second degree, it is a wanton and willful disregard for human life, or the fact that some people call it a heat of passion type crime, where maybe two people get into a fight and it goes on from there and one person dies as a result. I think sometimes, that's something that can be looked at. But in this case, how do we prove those elements when we don't know what really happened? So even if we think the business partner is shady and he ran away from the scene and he looked distressed and all of those things, as a prosecutor, I still have to be able to prove what happened. And that's the hard part.
And the only thing that we can actually know for sure from that video is that the business partner didn't really care that much about Brandon, in my opinion. I don't think that it proves that he did it. I actually lean towards Brandon accidentally falling down. I think that seems like it's more likely. But the fact that you don't, even if it was someone that you hated, I guess he could be intoxicated. I guess there could be some other factors there, but you really have to have questionable character to not try to get help for somebody who's in that type of situation.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference here between morally what's right and legally what we can prove.
Of course.
Right? Morally, absolutely, you should help someone, whether you know them, whether you don't. Absolutely, morally, you should do that. And if it were a circumstance where he could be convicted morally, then I think that would be pretty solid.
This is even calling the police, though. Like, it's not even you got to go down into that water and get them out. Like, even just calling the police and being like, hey, you don't even have to call him your friend. You can just say, this guy I know just fell into the river. We're on South Street. Please come and help. Like something.
Right. Absolutely. He should have done at least that minimal effort, and he didn't. But I have to look at it too from the prosecutor lens and say, okay, he didn't do that, but can I prove there was an intent to kill? Can I prove there was a willful and wanton disregard for human life that meets the elements for murder in the second degree? I just don't think we have enough detail or enough evidence to do that at this point.
I know I already brought this up, but I want to go back to it because I thought that was so strange to read that the police thought that he was being completely honest when it was very clear that he was not being honest, unless they, were like, well, he was so drunk that, he was probably seeing double. So maybe that is what he thought happened. But that reaction and then them saying, oh, well, we think he was being honest, when he came in and he was fully cooperative. I don't see how that can be the case. I guess you'd have to have more conversations with the police officers that were involved. That moment alone, the fact that he was like, yeah, I just lost sight of him and I thought that he went home. Like, that's so clearly a lie.
Just like we've talked about in the past, law enforcement may have had multiple interactions with this person. They may have had multiple interviews with this person. They probably were able to see and interpret the body language as he was speaking. They could, follow through with all of that. I have to give deference to law enforcement and to the prosecutor's office in this case. They know more about this than I do from a brief conversation or from, hearing Shirley be able to articulate everything that her family has seen on this case. So, the difficulty is we don't have all the pieces. I had a conversation with the prosecutor and, we reviewed some police reports that we saw online, but I still have to give deference to those who fully investigated it and fully looked at everything to say, can we prove this? And that's the hard part. I think it's painful to people when we just can't get the closure that they so rightfully deserve. I can't even fathom what Shirley and her family go through, not knowing what happened to Brandon in his final moments. That is probably the most heartbreaking thing ever.
Yeah, it's horrible. It has to be horrible. And from the conversations I've had with Shirley just over the years, it is. It's torturous. Another thing that really struck me from our conversation with Shirley was that none of the boys who are involved or their parents ever reached out to offer any condolences to Shirley. I thought that was so strange. And to her point, not to even, and I guess they were worried about being sued or something like that, but not to admit guilt or anything like that, but just, I'm so sorry for your loss. Like, I'm sorry that your son died. Here's a card. Here's a pat on the back. Here's some flowers. I mean, that seems so strange to me. They know more. Someone knows more. I'm not saying they all know more. Someone knows more. Someone out there has additional details. To the point that you made earlier, unfortunately, sometimes it takes years and years and years for these things to surface and for someone to come forward or someone to, admit their involvement in something. I just feel like someone out there has additional details, and someday someone's going to come forward and be able to provide those, or some level of guilt is just going to be so overwhelming that something comes out. And I hope it does, for Shirley's sake, for her family's sake. But do you not think that it's strange in this case that nobody offered any condolences that was directly involved with Brandon that night?
Yeah, to your point, I think our society has become so litigious and so afraid of being sued or being pointed at as a culprit in something, right? So ingratiated in the idea that, oh, I just need to stay out of it, and just not my business and mind my own business. I think people have truly lost sight of compassion and understanding for others. Had that been any of their sons that had gone missing and ended up, losing their life, I bet you everything that Shirley would have been there with a card or a pat or condolences or whatever else there might have been. I think she would have shown compassion just from the little bit of time I've met with her. I think she would have shown compassion where she didn't get that from others. And I don't understand that.
And I think it's exactly what you had said. And obviously I mentioned, and even Shirley mentioned, maybe it was just purely fear based. They didn't want to be sued. They didn't want to be seen as someone who was associated with nefarious activity in some way. And so they just decided to avoid it completely. So it's a difficult case. But if anyone out there has any additional information, please contact Shirley. If you could do anything to help bring closure to her and her family, I know that would mean the world to her. And I believe that there's still a reward for information as well out there. So if that's someone's motivation and that's what it takes for someone to come forward, I mean, people put rewards on that type of information, for financial rewards on that type of information, for a reason.
I do
Myrene,
believe someone has more details, and I hope for Shirley's sake that they come forward. And, quite honestly, their motivation to me doesn't really matter, whether it's for the reward or just to be a good person, or maybe the guilt has gotten to them. But Shirley deserves this. Brandon deserves to be able to rest in peace. And I think the only way to do that is to find the closure that they so rightfully need. Shirley talked so much about Brandon and what a good guy he was, and a good kid, and a good son, and a brother, and all of these things. And it's very sad when a life like that is cut so short. He had so much potential, and it sounded like so much talent in all of the business things he was doing and just everything else. And so please, again, if you do know anything, please come forward.
Myrene, is there anything else that you'd like to touch on related to the Brandon Mitchner case?
Again, I just, I appreciate the fact that the Eaton County prosecutor spent time with me discussing how thoroughly the case was investigated and how all the other agencies involved really put forth all the effort to try to figure out what happened. And again, I would simply say that it's heartbreaking that, a solution and answer isn't straightforward. to help the Mitchner family.
It is incredibly frustrating. Yes, thank you to Prosecutor John Duane for talking with you, because like you said earlier, he's under no obligation to have that conversation, but he clearly just wanted to make it known that every effort was made, and that, you know, had they been able to move forward with this case, that they would have. So if you have any questions, we would love to hear from you. Please message us on our Instagram page at BTV_pod.
And we do truly enjoy seeing your comments, and hopefully you like our podcast. So make sure you hit that like button as well.
You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.